Let me talk about a third way that CBO is misleading us. If you say we're throwing 10.5 million people off Medicaid, you got to give us the rest of the story. It's not fair to just take that out of context. Technically, they may be right. But did I mention, I can't remember if I mentioned this, these 10.5 million people weren't qualified to get Medicaid in the first place. Now, we also put in our reconciliation bill, as the president calls it, the big, beautiful bill, a work requirement.
Why is the left crying about 10 million people losing Medicaid when most of them were never eligible in the first place? This is one of the few times you'll hear a politician actually lay out the truth about Medicaid fraud, waste, and abuse, and how the so-called nonpartisan CBO is spinning the numbers to make common-sense reforms look like heartless cuts. This is the Prodigy Unfiltered.
I don't want to be unfair to CBO, but sometimes CBO makes these statements and they don't give you the context in which they're making the statements. If you say we're going to throw 10.5 million people off of Medicaid and don't explain in detail why they come to that conclusion, that's not fair. You're not getting the full story. You're not getting reliable information. That would be like asking a nun for advice about sex. So let me tell you the other half of the story. I talked about this last week a little bit. Of the 10.5 million people that CBO says we're throwing off of Medicaid, they weren't eligible for Medicaid in the first place. I'll say that again. CBO says we're throwing 10.5 million people off of Medicaid. They weren't eligible for Medicaid in the first place. I talked about this a little bit last week. For example, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services just came out a report with a report of those 10.5 million people that were throwing off of Medicaid. 2.8 million of them are double dipping. They're double dipping. That's illegal. That's a violation of the rules. That means that a person is signed up. I'm from Louisiana. That means some people are signed up in both Louisiana and Mississippi, for example. You can't double dip. And the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services also found that of that 2.5 million people, 1.6 million of them are double dipping by joining Medicaid and Obamacare. So yeah, they're going to lose their Medicaid. They should. That double dipping costs us $14 billion a year. $140 billion over 10 years. We think in 10-year cycles. That's money that we could use to help people who really deserve Medicaid. So yeah, my friends at CBO, those people are going to lose their Medicaid. Did I mention that they weren't entitled to it in the first place? Now, point two, the reason that the main determinant for Medicaid is income. It's not the only one. The main determinant is income. States are not supposed to sign up people for Medicaid who make too much money. And I regret to say this. I don't know why, but it's human nature. Some people don't tell the truth. Under President Biden, he encouraged the states not to check income eligibility. Just take everybody's word for it. Well, you've probably heard me say this before, but I trust people. But I also, when I play poker, I play with friends. They're good friends of mine, but I always cut the cards. I believe in the old adage, trust in God, but tie up your camel anyway. If the president sends a message to the states, don't worry about checking if people are making too much money, guess what? Some people are going to cheat, and they do. I wish they didn't, but they do. Back in my state of Louisiana, our Louisiana legislative auditor, which audits all the spending in the state, found that they did an exhaustive audit of our Medicaid program. They found back in 2019 that 1,600 people had been signed up for Medicaid, making over $100,000 a year. 1,600 people making over $100,000 a year. Yes, CBO, they're going to lose their Medicaid. They weren't entitled to it in the first place. The legislative auditor went on to point out that Louisiana paid $85.5 million in Medicaid payments for patients who weren't eligible for coverage because they made too much money. And my legislative auditor in Louisiana, we have a lot of people on Medicaid. He couldn't go through the numbers for each and every one of them, so he had to do a statistical sample. And he listed, I won't show you the list of all of them. You could stand on the thing and paint the ceiling. But he found, for example, on our Medicaid rolls in Louisiana, someone making $111,785. Here's another person on Medicaid making $126,284. Another making $104,921. Another making $114,797. This is Louisiana. Our median family income's only $56,000. These folks aren't qualified for Medicaid. They're taking money away from people who deserve it. So yes, CBO, who on this issue is giving us their advice, I'm going to say it again. It's like asking a nun about advice on sex. CBO's not telling us the full story. Yeah, they're going to lose their Medicaid. They're not qualified for Medicaid. They're cheating. Let me talk about a third way that CBO is misleading us. And I'm not saying CBO is doing it intentionally. Some may say otherwise, but I'm not saying that. I'm just saying they need to explain their answer. If you say we're throwing 10.5 million people off Medicaid, you got to give us the rest of the story. It's not fair to just take that out of context. Technically, they may be right. But did I mention, I can't remember if I mentioned this, these 10.5 million people weren't qualified to get Medicaid in the first place. Now, we also put in our reconciliation bill, as the president calls it, the big, beautiful bill, a work requirement. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes the best way to get back on your feet is to get off your ass. Now, the American people are the most generous people in the world. We spend trillions of dollars helping our neighbors. In our country, if you are hungry, we will feed you. If you're homeless, we will house you. If you're too poor to be sick, we will pay for your doctor. That's why we have Medicaid. That's why we have Medicare. But those who can work should work. Our social programs were not meant to be parking lots. They were meant to be bridges. Sometimes, it's not always. If you're disabled, you should be on Medicaid. If you're too poor, you should be on Medicaid. But we've got a lot of people on Medicaid, we're not sure exactly how many, who could work. They choose not to. So when we passed this bill, my Democratic friends opposed us every step of the way. But we passed, over their objections, a work requirement. Now, if you're on Medicaid, the expansion part of Medicaid, I don't want to digress here, but if you sign up on the expansion part of Medicaid, if you are 19 to 64 years old, if you're not disabled, so I'm not talking about a mother with a sick child in her arms. If you're 19 to 64, if you're not disabled, if you're healthy, and you don't have a child at home under 14, we're saying we'll give you Medicaid, but you've got to work. Not 40 hours a week, 80 hours a month. For 80 hours a month in return for the free medical care, you've got to go try to get a job. You can go to worker training, or you can do community service. And hopefully, you'll become gainfully employed and you won't need Medicaid. Because a person without a job is not healthy, he's not happy, and he's not free. We don't know exactly how many people are on the Medicaid expansion who...
The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is out here screaming that the reconciliation bill will throw 10.5 million people off Medicaid. And the left, the media, they lap it up because it makes for a good headline. Republicans are kicking people off health care. But here's the kicker. Most of these 10.5 million, they were never entitled to Medicaid in the first place. Let's start with the facts the CBO doesn't like to say out loud. Out of that 10.5 million, 2.8 million are double-dipping. And no, that's not some minor paperwork error. That's people signed up for Medicaid in 2 different states, or even better, signed up for both Medicaid and Obamacare. That's not just wrong, it's illegal. And you and I are paying for it. The cost? $14 billion. Every year. That's $140 billion over 10 years. Money that could go to the truly needy, the disabled, low-income families, sick children, instead of freeloaders gaming the system. And Democrats want to protect that? Really? Then there's the Biden factor. Under his watch, states were encouraged not to verify income eligibility. Just take people's word for it. Because apparently, Joe Biden thinks if you ask people how much they make, they'll all tell the truth. Let's get real here. When there's free money and no accountability, some people will lie. That's human nature. And in my home state of Louisiana, the legislative auditor found 1,600 people on Medicaid making over $100,000 a year. One guy was pulling in over $126,000 and still getting taxpayer-funded health care meant for the poor. That's $85 million in just my state going to people who don't qualify. And the CBO lumps these people into their 10.5 million being kicked off sob story? Please. That's not compassion. That's a scam. Now here's the part that really sends the left into meltdown mode. The bill adds a work requirement. If you're 19 to 64, able-bodied, not disabled, not caring for a young child, you've got to work 80 hours a month. That's 20 hours a week, or do job training or community service to keep your Medicaid. 80 hours a month. Folks, that's not cruel. That's basic responsibility. We're not talking about the elderly, the sick, or single moms with kids at home. We're talking about people who can work but choose not to. And the data says about 6% of Medicaid recipients, roughly 6 million people, are able-bodied adults who aren't working. At $9,000 per recipient, that's $54 billion a year. $500 billion over a decade. And we're supposed to just keep writing that check with no strings attached? Not in my America. Democrats love to act like work requirements are heartless. But here's the truth. The American people are the most generous in the world. We will feed the hungry, house the homeless, and heal the sick. But our safety nets were never meant to be parking lots. They're supposed to be bridges. If you're able-bodied and healthy, the best thing for you, the most compassionate thing, is to encourage you to work, earn, and contribute. Because a person without a job is not healthy, not happy, and not free. The left's version of compassion is to keep you dependent forever, so they can buy your vote. My version? Help you get back on your feet, so you don't need the government breathing down your neck. Here's the real kicker. Even after these reforms, Medicaid spending is still going up by 20% over the next 10 years. So this isn't about slashing Medicaid or throwing poor people off healthcare. It's about cleaning out the fraud, abuse, and freeloading so that the truly needy get the care they deserve. The CBO's scare tactics? All salt, no tequila. They want you to believe Republicans are the villains when we're the ones trying to make sure the program actually works for those who should be on it. Viewers, we've got a government right now that rewards fraud, punishes work, and calls it equity. If you care about our country, if you care about fairness, if you care about keeping programs like Medicaid sustainable for future generations, you've got to stand against this nonsense. The swamp doesn't want accountability, but we do. And if we don't speak up, they'll keep twisting the truth until hardworking Americans are the bad guys and scammers are the heroes. This bill isn't perfect, but it's a step toward sanity. And I'm telling you right now, without real reform, we're going to lose more than money. We're going to lose the soul of this country. So to the CBO, to the Democrats, to anyone clutching their pearls over this, stop protecting fraud and start protecting America. That's the truth they don't want you to hear. And that's why I'm here to tell it. This is Prodigy Unfiltered. Like, share, subscribe, and stay in the fight. God bless America.